Our diaphragm is anatomically designed to provide both respiratory function and stability of our thorax and lumbar spine. Dr. Paul Hodges and his research team has found that diaphragm indeed contributes to our whole body stability during voluntary movement. They also found that there is a trade-off between respiratory and stability function of the diaphragm. This indicates that when diaphragm is recruited too much for the stability function, the efficiency of our breathing can be compromised. Well, Pavel Kolaj and his research group found that people with chronic low back pain tends to show abnormal positioning and contractility of the diaphragm. Other researchers from Postural Restoration Institute has found that positioning and contractility of the diaphragm affects the tone of other postural muscles in the body through their fascial connection. A very common example of this is the hypertonicity of diaphragm that leads to overactivation of hip flexors, which in turn can entirely tilt our pelvis. This means that an optimal control of the balance between the stability and respiratory function is very important for our postural health. For this reason, it is important to know how we can optimize the coordination between the diaphragm and other important muscles that provide stability of our spine, thorax, and pelvis. I am going to refer to the spine, thorax, and pelvis as our core from now on, just for convenience. To understand how diaphragm is coordinated with other stability muscles in our core, we need to first understand how the core stability is achieved. The most widely accepted and evidence-based mechanism for core stability is distributed activation of the whole abdominal walls that creates intra-abdominal pressure. Let me expand a bit more on what that means. Intra-abdominal pressure is defined as the steady-state pressure that is concealed within our abdominal cavity that is formed by interaction between our organs and abdominal walls. Well, how do our organs and abdominal walls interact to create the pressure inside our abdomen? I'm going to borrow the diaphragm made by Dr. Maurice Gasparin to explain this. I mentioned briefly in the anatomy section that contraction of the diaphragm flattens and descends the diaphragm. This action of the diaphragm pushes the internal organs in the abdominal cavity downward. The linings of our organs are full of water. So as you can see in the picture here, this water creates hydrostatic forces that pushes against the diaphragm, pelvic floor, and abdominal walls. What is not shown in this picture is the arrow pointing upward to the diaphragm and downward to the pelvic floor. Now, this outwardly directed hydrostatic force itself is sometimes referred to as intra-abdominal pressure. However, when it comes to core stability, this is not the end of the story. What is more important is the proactive and reactive control of the abdominal wall, pelvic floor, and connective tissues that counter this intra-abdominal pressure. As you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, our abdominal cavity is often compared to an engine cylinder, with the diaphragm representing the piston that exerts the force downward. This is a great analogy if we want to explain how the outwardly directed pressure is generated. However, unlike the cylinder, our abdominal wall and pelvic floor are not rigid structure. And that is actually a good thing because then we can increase the volume within the abdominal cavity to mitigate the excessive pressure built in our body. As you can see in this formula, increasing the volume can decrease the internal pressure. So, as the diaphragm pushes down into the abdominal organs, abdominal walls expand out and pelvic floor descends a bit to create some volume within the abdominal cavity. However, we also don't want to expand the volume too much and too fast. This picture is an eagle-eye view of our abdominal cavity, and the blue arrows represent the hydrostatic pressure directed outward. As you can see, the pressure directed toward the spine has an important role for stabilizing the spine, especially during the activity that creates extensor stress to the spine, such as lifting a heavy weight. For this reason, our abdominal muscles should eccentrically contract as they passively lengthen so that we can maintain the optimal range of internal pressure. As you can see in the green arrow here, such eccentric activation of the abdominal walls exerts inwardly directed force into the abdominal cavity. The same thing happens with respect to pelvic floor muscles. As the pelvic floor descends to create volume, it eccentrically contracts to exert upwardly directed force into the abdominal cavity. So in the context of explaining core stability, intra-abdominal pressure is the net force between outwardly directed hydrostatic force and the inwardly directed force from our muscular activation. As you can imagine, this net force is a changing force, and this makes the story about breathing and core stability more interesting. Sometimes the term stability misrepresents the image of being static. But in reality, stability comes from ever-changing intra-abdominal pressure that is kept within the range of healthy amount of variability. So, in the next section, I will talk about how our neuromuscular system controls the intra-abdominal pressure. Stay tuned.